Data from the holiday ride program that showed over 1,260 people had been charged with impaired driving in December. I assume that number doesn't surprise you?
Doesn't surprise me, never fails to disappoint me.
Well, here we are, made it through another week. Welcome back to Closer Look with Michael Friscolanti. I'm Scott Sexsmith. It's finally Friday.
Yes, sir. I know.
I don't know about you, but I found this week, normally weeks here fly by. This one, the first one after the holiday break.
I think that's so true what they say about the early January. Like there's a bit of drag there, right?
God.
What do they say, January 5th, the most depressing day of the year or something? Is that 5th or 6th?
The first Monday back or just,
or whatever around that time of day. But you feel it, it's a grind, right?
I've been kicking a pop can all week, let me tell you.
I see you walking up and down the halls just kicking things.
Hands in my pocket, just kicking things. Waiting for Friday.
Yeah, speaking of kicking things, we kicked it yesterday. There was a lot of interesting conversation afterwards about the future of trustees in Ontario.
Yeah.
People are very passionate, obviously, about education, especially if you work in that sector. As we mentioned, we have lots of friends and family that work in that sector. It's not a simple thing you can measure being an educator. You're helping a kid learn to read. You're helping a kid maybe have some breakfast that they don't have at home. There's all kinds of things going on when you're in that sector. And people are very passionate about how school boards are run because, as we talked about yesterday, the local trustees are kind of that lifeline. They're elected. They're there. And they know the local issues. It's not someone in Toronto, for example, running a school board in Northern Ontario, for instance. And so people are very passionate about that issue and what that means to how education is run. But it was interesting to see some of their comments about this podcast, people saying, well, if it's one less level of bureaucracy, if it's going to save us a few bucks, I think there'll be, whatever happens, if they do make this decision, they're going to have to do some salesmanship on it.
Yeah, no question. Anyway, thanks to everybody who reached out either on site or through our direct email, which is always open, as you know, closerlook@villagemedia.ca. Okay, it's Friday. The weekend is here, and typically when that happens, we tend to let our hair down a little bit, maybe have a nice beverage through the weekend. And it's hard to believe, such a great organization that Mothers Against Drunk Driving is and always will be. But we still, to this day, have the discussion about drinking and driving.
Yeah, it's a daily discussion. We see people being arrested, for example. We see terrible collisions caused by impaired driving. And, the question that resonates in my head, and I'm not an expert at all in this, but it feels like none of that messaging is getting through, even though I'm sure it has because it has to have gotten better. Yeah. But it's especially over the holidays, but it happens all the time. You see, it must be once a week we read a tragic case in
and
one of our
communities. And it's a head shaker.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense. And, I feel like we've learned enough that, if we're going to be out drinking with friends, there's always an arrangement for everyone to get home.
Always.
There's no one's leaving the bar or leaving the restaurant, getting in their car after having a few. It just that's not the way we do things.
No.
We always plan in advance for that. And you assume that most people do that. And obviously they don't. And I'm not trying to be the judge and jury. I'm not passing judgment on people, but it's definitely a situation. I think the OPP said, what did they say, Scott? More than 1,000 impaired driver
over
charges.
1,200,
over the Christmas holidays. So that's just the OPP jurisdiction communities, like where the OPP's doing. That's not including the city police forces across Ontario. So 1,200 people charged with impaired driving. And to me, it's shocking. I would have thought maybe a couple hundred.
Yeah.
So today we're going to talk to the CEO of MAD Canada, Steve Sullivan, who's a very passionate individual about this issue. Obviously, this is what they spend their days advocating for tougher rules, for solutions, for education.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very timely time to have him come on. So we asked him on short notice, so we appreciate him taking the time.
For sure. As of January 1st, impaired drivers in Ontario will face some harsher new penalties if they're caught. The new rules include an automatic lifetime license suspension for a conviction of impaired driving causing death and an instant 7-day license suspension for first-time offenders caught under the influence, up from 3 days. Joining us tonight to talk about the new penalties and a lot more is Steve Sullivan. Steve is the CEO of MAD Canada, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Steve, before we get into some details, can you maybe just give our audience a quick refresher about MAD? Your organization has been around for a very long time and pushed some very important changes over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. We're a national registered charity, sort of officially, started in 1990, although there were some smaller organizations a bit before that. Obviously, MAD started in the U.S. With the death of a young woman. Her mother started that. We have a partnership connection with MAD, but we're two separate organizations. Right now, we have about 100 chapters across the country, and give or take 1,000 volunteers who help us get the message out about the risks of impaired driving.
Steve, can you give us some specifics about the new rules in the province that we just alluded to a moment ago, and your thoughts on how effective they will be in deterring impaired driving?
So the changes actually were announced in I think spring of 2024, and then went through the legislative process, I think passed in November 2024. And it costs a lot of these kinds of changes take time to come into effect. They have to make sure all the systems are in place. So the biggest changes, I think, that are now enforced, as you mentioned, the lifetime suspension for anyone convicted of impaired driving causing death. As it is now, judges can make a driving prohibition part of a sentence. And for one fatality, and I hate to face it that way, you're generally going to see 6, 7, 8 year suspension. So obviously the Ontario government wanted to send a strong message. We made some recommendations. Maybe we can touch on that in a moment. There's also, as you mentioned, the longer short-term suspensions for those drivers. Often those are drivers who have tested in the warn range, so the provincial level. So not at a criminal level, but in the 0.05 to 0.79 blood alcohol level. So, a little harsher suspensions there, and those are very effective in changing people's behavior. And then the other one I think that came into effect, there's other ones that haven't yet, but the other one was a mandatory remedial program for first-time individuals. That's just building on programs that are available now, but this again expands those individuals who are open to it. The main one that hasn't come into effect yet that I think will in the summer is mandatory ignition interlocks for all of those caught driving impaired. So that'll be a really important initiative that we really pushed with the government. So a lot of positive changes. There's no one single solution, but every step helps.
So that means, Steve, that if you have a conviction on your record, you have to have one of these devices in your car going forward?
Yeah. Prior to that, it wasn't required. On paper, it was a requirement, but people could just wait out. So, you would get a requirement, you had to have it for a year. So somebody could wait that year out. They couldn't drive, but they could wait it out and not have the ignition interlock installed and still get their license back at the end of that period. So this is a requirement now that if you don't get the interlock installed for that period, you don't get your license back. So this is, I think, a really positive initiative.
Yeah, and would that last for a certain amount of time, depending on the severity of this? Yeah, it's great.
It's about a year, and then if someone wants to adopt it early on, you can maybe do it like a few months short of that kind of thing. So it's an encouragement to get people to engage with the technology as quickly as possible.
Yeah, we'll go down some rabbit holes with various different things, but just staying on this one for a minute, that's a fascinating one to me too, because there's the shame element as well, right? I mean, sometimes that can be a real factor in helping people to change their behavior, right? Knowing that this might be they have to get in the car after work and blow into this device.
Yeah, I think if you're going to pick up, if you have a new date, you've met somebody, you're going to pick up your girlfriend, boyfriend, you're meeting their parents, or you're going to, with your friends, and you have to blow in. You're right. I think there is a shame factor to that, and it's hard to ignore if someone's sitting in your car.
Steve, you mentioned the recommendations. Let's just jump back to that for a sec. I'm sure that your organization provided the province with a slew of them. Which ones didn't get met, and maybe ones that you were disappointed by that not happening?
Yeah, the one that we recommended, in terms of the lifetime suspension for those convicted of impaired driving death. I mean, obviously, the most serious offense, you commit tremendous harm. We work with families who've experienced such loss. But what we know about driving prohibitions, and they often don't work that well. People continue to drive. And you can imagine if you're 20 years old or 30 years old and you get a lifetime driving suspension, you're not going to drive for 40, 50, 60 years. I think for a lot of people, that's unrealistic. And so what we recommended to the government was to consider imposing longer term, even lifetime ignition interlock requirements, or maybe there's a period where someone's been alcohol free for 15 years, you look at it, but a longer period of ignition interlocks. Because what happens now is people who have driving prohibitions, if they continue to drive, they're driving illegally. they could be driving impaired, and they're driving without insurance. So if they do get into a fatal crash or a serious crash, there's a lot of consequences for people. Interlocks, nothing's perfect, but you're driving legally, safely, and you have insurance. So we thought that was probably a better way to go.
Why do you think they didn't choose that? Was it because of the headlines better?
I think they wanted to send a message, about how serious they take this. And the thing about the organizations like ours is conversations never end. They just get put off. And so those are conversations that we're still having.
For sure. Steve, obviously, this may sound like a dumb question, but these are important changes. The average Joe who's not as knowledgeable about this as you are may read these and say, well, that might not make a big difference. From your perspective, why are these so important, these changes that came into force?
Well, what we know about deterrence is what changes people's behavior. The first is their perception of getting caught. And that's why law enforcement's really so important. High visible, high profile law enforcement. We saw a lot during the holidays with ride programs, those kinds of things. But the second thing is the immediacy of the sanctions. So the kinds of sanctions that you're talking about here, these are, immediate sanctions that are imposed on individuals. You lose your license for 7 days immediately. And that may not sound like a lot, but if you have to use your car to get to work every day, if you have to get the kids to daycare, that's an imposition on your life. And the goal of these kinds of sanctions is to hold people accountable, but hopefully also send a message that you just don't want to do this again, because the next time you get caught, it'll be longer periods of time and you might have your vehicle impounded, those kinds of things. So it may not sound like a lot to people, doing a remedial program or license suspension 7 days. But if you're the one who has to deal with it immediately now, it does have an imposition on your life and hopefully sends a message.
Steve, we're obviously fresh through the holiday season. And on Monday, the OPP releasing data from the holiday ride program that showed over 1,260 people had been charged with impaired driving in December. I assume that number doesn't surprise you?
Doesn't surprise me, never fails to disappoint me. We're never going to arrest our way out of this problem, but especially during the holidays with all the awareness and the awareness of people that law enforcement are going to be out there and very active with ride programs and proactively looking for drivers, that so many people still make that choice. I mean, it's never a good time to make that choice. And there's so many options for people, especially in more urban communities. There's no excuse. And it's disappointing that so many people make that choice. On the other hand, it's heartening to see that law enforcement are so active in trying to take as many drivers off the road as they can.
Why do you think that is, Steve, that so many are still making that choice? We were talking about that on the before you jumped on. And this is an issue, too, because we see it, sadly. We have community sites all over the province. Yeah. Once a week, Steve, there's a horrible accident or something that involves an impaired driver. Yeah. Why is it so many people are still making this choice, even though organizations like yours have been hammering home this point for so long?
Well, we ask people, when us and other organizations do polling and ask people, why would you do that? And so people who admit that they have driven after consuming or they feel they were impaired, they often say they didn't have far to go. They thought they could go like a back road. They wouldn't see a police officer and they could just drive a little more carefully. And obviously none of those are good excuses, but no one ever thinks they're going to get into a crash. No one ever thinks they're going to hurt someone else or, hurt themselves or kill themselves. But it happens everywhere. It happens every day somewhere in the country. But none of us ever see ourselves in that phase. And so it's an ongoing conversation. It's why high profile, highly visible law enforcement is really important, because if you don't ever think you're getting into a crash, that's not going to deter you. But maybe if you think you're going to see a police officer, that'll change your behavior.
Steve, is there a jurisdiction that sticks out anywhere in the world that's dealing with impaired drivers in a way that we here in Canada or specifically in Ontario should be mimicking?
Yeah, I mean, there's, certainly provincially, every province has sort of a different approach. And they're not, I want to make them wildly different, but there are a couple of provinces, British Columbia being the first, that brought in a new program that sort of deals with first-time impaired drivers a little bit differently. It's called immediate roadside prohibitions, and it sort of mirrors the system we have now. So in Ontario, we have a system, if you're at 0.05 to 0.79 blood alcohol, you get provincial sanctions, but not a criminal record. There's no criminal charges. What British Columbia did was take that model, but expand it to some offenders who are actually at the 0.08 level, so criminal. They avoid the criminal system and proceed with harsher provincial penalties. Now, that sounds a bit counterintuitive. They actually saw significant reductions in impaired deaths and fatalities. and injuries, in part because police can process those cases within 30 to 40 minutes at roadside. If you go criminal, it takes 3 to 4 hours back at the station.
Yeah.
So your officers are dealing much quicker with impaired drivers. They're back out on the road, hopefully catching more impaired drivers. And we saw in Winnipeg, because Manitoba has this as well, in a 5-year period, they doubled the number of impaired drivers they took off the roads.
Wow.
We think that's a model that Ontario should be looking at for some offenders. Obviously, no deaths, injuries, crashes, not repeat offenders, no kids in the car. So there are restrictions, but it is a way of we think, maximizing police time. And you're also avoiding a criminal justice process, which we know in Ontario is incredibly overburdened.
That's for sure.
And could use a break from some of these cases.
That's a great point. Thanks for pointing that out, Steve. From a 10,000 feet view, are things getting any better, Steve? Like when you think of Mad Canada for the last 30 years, are we making an impact?
Yeah, we have. And it's sometimes hard to see because we see the cases every single day. But if you look in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, certainly societal attitudes have changed a lot. And that's important. But we have seen the reductions in fatalities, really around alcohol by about 50% from like the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now there's, the last data that we've seen is 2023. There was a slight increase in that. And so we're always going to see that. Coming out of the pandemic, we're sort of seeing a little bit of an increase, but we're hopefully seeing that going down. In the U.S., on the other side, they saw huge increases during the pandemic, and they're coming down. So the pandemic sort of, I think really shot the numbers. So I think prior to the pandemic, we were seeing some decreases with alcohol. It's sort of level loss, but still some positive signs. We have been seeing increases with the presence of drugs for a number of years. We can't always articulate presence meaning impairment because it's just a different substance, but a concerning trend. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Yes.
We're seeing some improvements here, maybe some clawbacks in other areas.
You're right about the societal changes. That's why I think we get surprised when we see the numbers because we assume that society's changed. I just have a few more questions. Thank you, Steve, for all your time. One of the debates in our industry, I'm the editor-in-chief here at Village. I've been in journalism for 25 years. One of the big debates we have all the time is naming or not naming people accused of crimes. And impaired driving has become one of the big ones in the debate, as you know, because some police forces have made a conscious choice to no longer name alleged impaired drivers. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any police services in Ontario today that routinely make people's names public. I think Niagara was the last police services that did it every month, and they stopped doing that. There was no evidence that it had any sort of deterrent impact. Like I know people talk about shame and public shaming, which you think would have an impact. But I think a lot of the police services that did it found that it really didn't move the needle either way. So, I understand people's feelings. It is public information if someone is charged, and you can go to the courthouse and get all the information, that kind of thing. But there really was no evidence that it had any relevant impact.
It's interesting because for people who don't know, in Niagara, for example, they would publish a weekly list of here are the people who were accused of impaired driving this week. And some weeks it would be a long list, right? And they thought they did that. I think they actually said it every week. They did it because we wanted to deter people. But you're right. There was no empirical evidence that showed that it was actually making a difference.
Name and shame.
So you're okay with that, Steve? That's not something you had a problem or your organization disagreed with?
Yeah, it wasn't something we really had a position on. I know police services tried it, and I know I think York Police did it for a while, and they stopped doing it. So I don't think it had the result that they expected it to. Okay,
I do want to ask you about the Ford government's also floated this possibility of taking an idea from Texas, I believe, with the forcing impaired drivers who cause death of children to pay child support. What is MAD's position on that?
Yeah, love the idea. Anything we can do to provide better support, particularly to young people who are left behind if their parents are killed. We looked at the Texas model, and actually it's Texas model came from other states because it's in about 8 or so states now, resulted from a grandmother who's now caring for her grandchildren. I think there's some problems with it. Basically what it would mean is that a court could order a particular driver to be financially responsible for those children up until the age of 18. Under our system now in Ontario and most provinces, that's really what insurance is for.
Yes.
And so in the U.S., you can't do both. You either pick insurance or you pick the driver. And our advice to families would always be, and I think any lawyer would do the same, is pick insurance, because that's a guaranteed. It's not perfect. I'm not, we all know there's issues with that, but there will be some drivers who maybe could compensate or finance those children, but there's a lot of individuals who won't. These are people who are probably going to go to prison for a couple of years. People might think it should be longer. They're going to come out into a halfway house with a criminal record. Then they're going to be in the community, may not have much in terms of job prospects. Under the Texas legislation, drivers have a year after being released from prison to start the payment. So who's going to fund that those children up until that point? So I think the sentiment is good. Maybe there's pieces we can take from it and enhance what we have now. But I think it would be detrimental to replace what we have now with that kind of system.
Okay, I do want to go back to one more thing we talked about earlier. You mentioned the education programs that your organization does, where you'll actually talk to people who've been charged. Tell us a success story, Steve, where you really made an impact on a driver, or people, so help people understand how these programs work.
Yeah, so it's not a widespread program we have, but some of our chapters get involved with like their local probation offices. Toronto being one of the most important ones, a program called Missing You. And obviously, I don't hear names of individuals, but I do know that many of the families who participate will often talk about, there might be 30 people in the room, and let's be honest, some of them are just there because they have to be, but they talk about people who come up after privately in tears and just say how much it meant to them, or might share their own story about someone who they lost through an impaired driving and maybe have substance abuse issues and led them here. But a lot of the families who participate on our behalf do believe and feel that they're touching individuals and hopefully raising enough awareness in them that if they're in a situation where maybe they get caught, weren't planning on drinking, but they have that the words that they share, the stories they share will have an impact on individuals. For sure.
Sorry, I tend to hog the mic sometimes. I'm sorry, Scott.
No, it's all right.
I have my last question for me, Steve. I appreciate it. What's your message tonight then for someone who might be listening to this podcast and thinking, this isn't for me. I'm going to still go to the bar tonight, have a few beers with my friends after work, and
I'll be fine.
And drive home. I'll be fine.
So I would say go and do the first part. If you want to go out with your friends and have a few beer, go do that. The second part is just not smart. There was a poll before Christmas that said people, how do you decide if you're going to drive? And some people say, if I'm drinking, I'm not going to drive, and that's great. Others said, I try to, it's how I feel, or I try to calculate how many drinks I had. And both of those are really stupid ways of making a decision. There's so many, especially if you're in Toronto, I'm in Ottawa, and certainly in cities, there's no excuse.
No.
And even if the worst case scenario is getting into a crash, you kill yourself, your passenger, somebody else. But even if you get stopped by a police officer, like if you get charged criminally, that's a criminal record. That means you may not be able to travel outside of Canada. There's limits on that. Some of us might mean our jobs. If you have to drive for work, then you're in a big trouble. You compare, and then you have to pay a defense lawyer and all the fees. You're talking thousands of dollars versus the cost of an Uber or a taxi or a bus, or even worse, a hotel, $100, $200. Like there's just nothing in that scenario that's worth the risk financially to yourself, but also to your life and everybody else's. So I would say go have fun. Just make sure that you get home safely and are there to have fun tomorrow night as well.
Well said. Download the Uber or Lyft app. It's so easy. Steve, before we let you go, anything that we didn't cover, anything that your organization is working on that you want to tell everyone about, the mic is yours.
Yeah, I think ultimately, we need to do more what we're doing, education, awareness, law enforcement. But ultimately, the solution will be in technology. There's legislation in the U.S. that will require all new cars to have some kind of anti-impaired driving technology by 2030. We're hoping that, obviously the way cars are made in North America, that will follow suit. But that will have a huge impact because it may detect, it may intervene if someone is impaired. And ultimately, I think it'll be technology that will be one of the biggest game changers in this area.
All right. There's Steve Sullivan, the Chief Executive Officer of Mothers Against Drunk Driving Canada. Steve, appreciate your time tonight. Have a wonderful weekend.
My pleasure. Thank you both.
I wonder if Steve ever gets to a point when you hear those numbers, over 1,260 impaired drivers, from one law enforcement agency, do you just feel like you're beating your head against the wall?
Right, because we mentioned if you add some of the city ones up, there's hundreds in some of the big cities like Toronto and London. You add that up. He makes a great point, and I think he said it very diplomatically. How stupid you have to be. You know it's Christmas. You know that they're all over the place.
They tell you our ride program is starting now.
They have a press event where they say, hello, everybody. Here we are on the main street, and we're going to be here all through Christmas. And the fact that people still get pulled over for that is mind-boggling to me. But he's realistic too, because he's not sitting there going, "This is going to be the year where there's going to be zero," because that's just not going to happen, right? But he makes a great point about societal changes and how we feel differently. You think about the way our grandparents' generation thought of drinking and driving. Yeah, they all did it.
Oh my God!
We were in the cars, right?
While they were smoking, with no seatbelts on.
That's right. But it's tragic, right? Because we really do see it on a regular basis. We see it in our communities all across Ontario. There are tragic impaired driving cases way too often. Yeah, and like Steve said, these aren't minor things. These are life-changing events that impact people, and they're tragic. They're horrible. So hopefully, a few people listen tonight and realize, you know what, that is stupid what I'm doing. Yes. Let's get an Uber today and get home.
Very encouraging, though, to hear that auto manufacturers by 2030 will have some kind of a mechanism.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that, which is pretty interesting when you think about it. It makes sense, right?
Of course it does.
I mean, it's just like similar to a seatbelt, right? You have to put your seatbelt on. There's seatbelts here. It's in the car. You can use it. It's actually a good idea. If we're going down the technology road, Scott, we're way past it, right? We're down there. We're down there now. So, I mean, if we can use it in ways like that, then I'm all for that.
All right. Let's put a bow on this week and kick off our weekend. Closer look at villagemedia.ca is our direct email. And, of course, you can watch back episodes and subscribe to our nightly newsletter at closerlook@villagemedia.ca. No, that's the wrong one. See, there's just too many things. Yeah. Closerlookpodcast.ca. That's right. I need a prompter or something.
I wonder what happens if you send a message that other email you just said. Try it. See what happens.
You know what? Eventually it'll get to us.
Yeah, try it.
Or a member of our very large team of 3.
Going through the thousands of emails a day.
That's right. Yeah, it's not quite at 1,000, but Derek Turner, as always, at the controls this evening. Michael Friscolanti, our editor-in-chief here at Village Media. We appreciate your time this week. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Have a wonderful weekend. We're back Monday night at 7 right here on Closer Look.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.